and Thespina for reading that well-known passage to us, right? We've heard that story of that Lord, that Master, looking for workers. And in the story, Jesus is again stressing to us something that we all are in need of. Something we all need to receive. We all, in one way or another, search for it. And eventually it's all waiting for us. That's called the grace of God. After all, it's all about grace. That was also the case with the mayor of New York City, Fiorello LaGuardia. He was the mayor of New York during a lot of the days of the Great Depression in the last century, and also during World War II. And he had a nickname. People called him the Little Flower because he was only 5 foot tall, and he always had a dandelion in his lapel of his jacket. He was a colorful character. He was not someone that you would constantly see sitting in the office and just doing all the admin. No, he loved to be among people. And so you could even find him sometimes jumping on the fire trucks and just taking a ride. Or he would take a whole orphanage, all the kids, and took them to a baseball game. During strikes of the newspapers, which regularly could happen, it's known that he would go on the radio and read the Sunday funny stories to the kids. So he was a mayor who really wanted to be engaged with people. And it was in 1935, the story tells us, that it was very cold. January 1935, it was really, really cold. And the mayor had decided that evening to go to court, to a night court. He had told the judge, "You work so hard, you take a night off. Take some rest." And he took the seat of the judge. Within a few moments, an old woman was brought before him. And the woman had been charged with stealing bread, a loaf of bread. And so the mayor, as he was sitting there, he asked her, "Lady, why did you steal that loaf of bread?" And she told the mayor that the husband of her daughter had left her. Herself being sick, this daughter, and then having 2 grandchildren starving. The shopkeeper from whom the bread had been stolen did not want to drop the charges. He spoke to the mayor, who was now the judge, and he said, "Dear judge, this is a real bad neighborhood, and we need to make an example. She needs to be punished so that all the others will know that we are serious about these things." LaGuardia, the mayor, he sighed. And he turned now to the woman and he said, "You know, I have to punish you. The law makes no exceptions. I have to punish you, and the fine will be $10 or 10 days in jail." But as he spoke the sentence, the mayor had already reached inside his pocket, and he took out a $10 bill and threw it into his top hat. And he said, "Here is the $10 fine, which I now collect as judge, and I'm going to fine everyone here in this courtroom 50 cents for living in a town where a person has to steal bread so that her grandchildren can eat." So he said, "Mr. Bailiff, please take my top hat and start collecting the 50 cents and then give the money to the old lady." And the next day in the newspapers of New York, it was reported that $47 were given to a confused old lady who had stolen a loaf of bread to feed her starving children. 50 cents of that amount were, of course, from the red-faced grocery store owner, who was not happy at all. But there were 70 other petty criminals. Some had been called in for traffic violations, others because they had been caught drunk, all kind of misdemeanors. There were even the policemen who had brought in some of these people that had done wrong, and all of them had just paid their 50 cents, but now gave the mayor a standing ovation. Now here's my question, church. Did the elderly lady who had stolen the loaf of bread, did she get what she deserved? Well, I guess we all would say no, right? No, she did that. No, what she received, that's not right. She had stolen a loaf of bread. Yes, sure, people can have all kind of reasons, but stealing is stealing, right? That's what I was told by my grandmother of having taken something from the kitchen that I shouldn't have. Some money was lying there. And the ice cream sort of little cart, it was actually a bicycle with a box in the front, and the ice cream was in there. Goes back a few years, yes. And I had taken that money from my grandmother. And I went to get my ice cream, thinking that she would not know. But of course, here I was parading around in the neighborhood with an ice cream in my hands. Stealing is stealing. No matter the reason, punishment does have to follow. Well, my grandmother punished me. She said, "Geert, did you like your ice cream?" I mean, it was a bit of money there, so I had bought the biggest one. She said, "Let's have another one." And for some reason, the second one didn't taste as good anymore. I was so filled up, maybe. But she taught me a lesson. She taught me a lesson of what it means to be found out and then being dealt with. But what do we see in the story of this old lady? Isn't it what we would call grace? Grace is when one who has more power shows them kindness, mercy to someone who is in a lesser position, someone who does not have the power. The mayor, LaGuardia, instead of punishing this lady, he paid the fine himself and then even collected 50 cents from everyone there in court and gave it to her. It was more than she deserved, we would say, right? That's what we call grace. And that is what the gospel this morning, that beautiful passage read by our two young ladies, thank you so much again, tells us it's about grace. It's about grace that Jesus is trying to teach there. The parable, the story with a lesson in it of workers in the vineyard. And it would have been a situation that was so well known because people grew up in these villages and they would see those who did not have a job each day, they would be there in the market square and would be waiting to see if someone would need them and would then ask them, "Would you be willing to come and work for me, and this will be the pay?" And Jesus is using a very common situation that people knew in those days to say something about the kingdom of heaven, to try to describe what that kingdom of heaven looks like. And we know when Jesus tries to describe something through common knowledge, through a common story, a common situation, he's trying to touch something that is fundamentally going wrong in society at that moment. He says a landowner went out and he hired workers for his vineyard. And the story says some of them were hired early in the morning, like today, early in the morning, coming together. And then he would tell them what he would pay them. He would pay them the usual wage for a day's work. If you're going to work for me for this whole day, this is what I'm going to pay you. But then the story tells us that several times over that day, the landowner goes back to probably the market square and find more workers waiting there to get a job. And each time as he hires new ones, he tells them that he would pay them what was right. And at the end of the day, the landlord comes and he pays the workers. And he begins with paying the ones who he had hired last. The ones at the end of the day who had been brought in, and he pays them first. And he pays them, as the story says, a full day's wages. Now, how would you feel about that? I mean, you've been hired early in the morning and you see this happening. I mean, I can so imagine what that must have been felt like for those who start early in the morning. Like, they're going to get a full day's wages for only maybe an hour, 2 hours work. I've been here for 8 or 10 hours or maybe even longer. Let me see. Let me get my calculator out of my pocket and see how much I would get then. Because times, for sure, these people would have been excited, hearing what these last hour workers received. If he paid them this amount, man, we're going to get really a good pay today. But as the story very quickly tells us, the excitement is being taken away. In fact, it turns into bitterness, anger. Because when they are being called by the Lord, they receive the same wages. They've been working all day, but they get the same amount. And the landlord, he heard them grumbling. And he's even trying to explain to them that he is not unfair at all to them. Because isn't that the words that Jesus described? He said, "Did I not already told you what you would be paid? This is what we agreed on." And after all, the story said, it was his money. So it would be his right to be generous if that's what he would choose to do. Now, there's nothing more to the story then. We don't get more insight in how now these workers who had been working the whole day get the same amount of pay as the one at the end of the day, how they responded to that comment. After all, it's a parable. But when you look at the story itself, it seems like that this landowner did not really know much about business. Because could you imagine the next time that this businessman would go back to the square again and ask early in the morning for workers, how many people would say like, yes, me. Or we think like, you know what? Let's just wait. Let's just wait till the afternoon, end of the afternoon. If he still needs us, we'll go because we get the same amount paid. What they did get was mercy. The ones who came at the end of the day, receiving the same amount as those who came at the beginning of the day, they did not get what they deserved. Not in our terms, not in our language, not in our way of thinking. They received mercy. And mercy is at the heart of grace. And when we've talked about this passage, which has come around in our Sabbath school classes and other times, we know how to fill in the names of the different characters. I mean, the landowner, we know it shows a picture of God. The workers, that is us. And the pay is something about that kingdom of heaven. And looking closer at this parable, we come to know again, it is all about grace. It's all about grace because, first of all, church, the parable says and teaches us that grace is received. It's been given, and we receive it. It's not deserved. For all of us, people of faith, we learn that the grace is not deserved. That none of us could say like, I've been so good. I already know that grace is mine because I've done so well. Now we know, all of us, that grace is received and not deserved. And the writer Philip Yancey wrote a wonderful book on that topic of grace, and I love the title that he gave to it. The title was, "What's So Amazing About Grace?" What is so amazing about grace? And as you read through that wonderful book that I can really recommend, he concludes that there is nothing that you or I can do that will put us into a position where we can say, I deserve the grace of God. I should get it. All we can do is just receive the gift, a gift that God offers to all of us, and it is for free. Now, in another writer's book called Healing Grace, David Siemens ends his wonderful book about the story of the Habsburg, political and powerful nation in Europe. The Habsburg, more than 600 years, had the absolute political power in Europe. And then in 1916, Emperor Franz Joseph I of Austria, he died. And as was common in those days, the funeral, especially when it's of an emperor, the imperial funeral was massive, was extravagant. And it would be so large that never any funeral would be repeated in such a massive way. The casket, covered in black velvet and gold imperial collars over it, was followed by all the powers, all the leaders, all the great men of those days. A military band led the procession. And by the light of torches at the end of the day, the group went down the stairs of the Capuchin monastery in Vienna. And when you would go down on those steps, you would come to this massive iron door leading to the Habsburg's family crypt. And behind the door, there was the Archbishop, Cardinal Archbishop of Vienna. And the officer who was in charge of this ceremony, he stood in front of this massive iron door, and he did what for centuries the formula had decreed. This is how it was to happen. And so he stood in front of this iron door and he cried out, "Open up! Open up!" And then a muffled voice on the other side of this massive iron door, you could hear say, "Who goes there?" It was the voice of the cardinal. "We bear the remains of His Imperial and Apostolic Majesty, Franz Joseph I, by the grace of God, Emperor of Austria, King of Hungary, Defender of the Faith." And the officer continued with a list of the emperor, 37 titles more to come. So that was a long list of all kind of titles. And as the officer finished, again, the voice on the other side of the door, the cardinal's response was, "We know him not. Who goes there?" The officer in charge spoke again, this time using a much shorter title. A title that was used only in times when things quickly had to be decided. Again, the cardinal said, "We know him not. Who goes there?" And now the officer tried a third time. No more titles. And he said this, "We bear the body of Franz Joseph, our brother, a sinner like us all." And the iron doors opened, and the casket with the deceased Franz Joseph was allowed into the crypt. You see, no matter who we are, no matter what titles we have, no matter how much we have or not, none of it can open the way to God's grace. It doesn't matter. Nothing will bring us in. Grace, the Bible teaches us in this story again and many other passages, grace is freely given. And all that is left to you and me is to openly receive it. Openly receive that grace. So grace is received. It's not deserved. Secondly, God's grace is about mercy. It's not about fairness. You see, what would have been fair would be that those who worked just the last few hours of the day, they would have been paid less than the ones who had been paid the whole day, right? That is how it works in our economy. That is how it works in our thinking. Someone who has done the least should not get the same, should get less. You see, that would be fair. What happens in this story, we would still conclude in today's language, that is not fair, right? I mean, I still remember those situations with my sisters. Whenever they would receive something from my parents, one of them, then either my older sister or myself would talk about my younger sister like, that is not fair. Why does she get this and we don't? And actually, I think we said it a lot more about a younger sister than any of us as the two older ones. Because we felt that the youngest one was much more spoiled than we were. And if she were to follow this live stream, she would just be again nodding her head like, oh, that's so not fair. That's not true, Geert. But you see, this fairness thing, this aspect, it's somewhere ingrained within us. We always tend to seem to have these scales with us. Do I get what I deserve? Does that person get something more that they don't deserve? You see, when we speak about grace, when we think about grace, looking at the story, it's something different than fairness. Grace is mercy. God loves us and mercifully gives us more than we deserve. Larry Burkett, a Christian financial consultant, learned that the hard way himself. It was at the start of his career that he leased an old building for his office. And it proved to become a nightmare for him. For about 4 years, he tried to work in that building, but actually the building was sinking. The building was sinking because it had been built on very cheap foundation. And each year it was sinking about 5 centimeters. Now, if you live in a house, like for instance we do, we live in an old little cottage. And these summers, we notice that because we don't have that much rain, the ground is starting to dry up more and more. And a lot of our houses where we live are built on clay. And I can see the cracks in our walls everywhere. And I'm looking at this house and thinking like, will it still stand when I come back? I mean, the grounds are just sinking. Now here was this man, this Larry, who had his office on the ground and on a foundation that was poorly built. And so for the 4 years that he tried to work there, he had power cuts. He had weeks where water was either not running or water was running coming from the wrong places. And it was hard to do his work in there. And so eventually, after about 4 years, he decided to move his business somewhere else. And for 2 months, he had been settled into a new building where everything was perfect. And then he received a call from the landlord from his previous place. And the landlord demanded that Burkett would come back and would redecorate the place, repaint it and remodel it again to make it well. To which again, you and I probably immediately would think like, well, wait a minute, that's not fair because you as a landlord should have taken care of that building, that it was right. And that's what Burkett felt. This Christian solicitor, he felt that this is not right. I'm not going to take care of that. And so he called his attorney. And he said, what do I do with this? And the attorney agreed that Burkett had done everything that he could during the 4 years to work in that office. He had done all that was required, and he should not do anything further. But as the father spoke with his attorney, the son was overhearing the conversation. And when the attorney had left, he went into the office of his father and said, Father, can I give you some different advice? Let me remind you, Dad, that this man, this landlord, only a few years earlier, he and his wife lost their only child in a tragedy. And Father, they were suffering through it, and they probably are still suffering. The pain is still real and fresh. And now the father, Burkett, he remembered indeed that actually he had tried many times to tell his landlord like that he was available. If there's anything I can do, please let me know. I want to help you to carry this loss. And so the son of Burkett suggested that maybe this would be a wonderful opportunity to do just that, Daddy, what you promised, what you tried to do a couple of years ago. Not doing what was fair, but do what is merciful. So Burkett thought about what his son had said. And the story tells us that he spent several $1,000s to work on the old office that he used to lease. He worked on it and spent several $1,000s to a place that most people would have said, like, it's not worth it. You see, that is where something goes beyond fair and goes into the area of being merciful. And God's grace is like that. God's grace is about that mercifulness. First, grace is received, it's not deserved. Secondly, God's grace is about mercy, not about fairness. And thirdly, finally, God's grace is for the last as well as for the first. See, sometimes it's easy for you and me to say that we deserve more, because after all, we are the people. We have been faithful. We heard the call of Christ and we stayed faithful to that call for so many years. And yet, in this parable, we find a God who seemed to work in a different way. See, today and every day until His coming, God searches for a relationship with each and every person, us here and everyone. Those hired first thing in the morning, to those that only manage to put in an hour at the end of the day. God wants a relationship with everyone. That is what grace is all about. That's the grace a woman was shown. There was grace that also this woman now had to share. I mean, she, as a young child, had been sexually abused by her dad. And as she grew up, she started to live somehow with that emotional pain, that damage that had been done to her. And as she grew up, she became a Christian and eventually married. And years later, now her own children were young adults. One morning, a letter was dropped through the letterbox in her house. And as she picked it up, and she looked at the back, she saw the name of her father written on the back of the letter. And as she opened the envelope and she read the letter, she could see what had happened. The father was telling her that he had become a Christian too. And in the letter he said that he had been asking God for forgiveness. But in the asking of forgiveness to his Father in heaven, he also realized that he had sinned against her. And now in his writing, he was asking her for forgiveness. And as she was reading the letter, emotions were coming up. Feelings were coming up that she hadn't felt for a long time, that she thought they had gone. They were no longer part of her, but now they came to the surface. Feelings of unfairness, feeling of bitterness. This is not right. This is not fair. My dad should be paying for what he had done to her. This was too easy. Now he was going to be part of God's family. No way. That can't be right. And in her bitterness, she already saw pictures of her home church celebrating the fact of her father saying yes to the Lord Jesus. And she saw pictures of a fattened calf being killed, and there would be a party for Daddy. That there would be a party, for the lost father had come home. But all she felt was anger. She was hurt. All she wanted was revenge. Then one night, she had a dream. She saw her father standing on an empty stage. And then above the father, in her dream, she saw these hands, the hands of God appearing. And in the hands, a white robe was held. And the white robe was lowered down towards her father. And she recognized the white robe because in her dream, she saw herself standing there in an equal white robe. And as the rope descended, was lowered down, closer to her father, the woman woke up. And she woke up feeling the tears were running down her cheek. The only way she was able to get past all of her feelings, all of her hurt, all of her bitterness, was to realize that her earthly father, her dad, who had done terrible things to her, was now the same as she was. In God's eyes, they were the same, a child of Him. Now, when we hear stories like this, don't we feel inside something similar? That's what the daughter felt. This feeling like, but that's not right. That's something else should happen. But she learned that God's grace was also for her dad. The same grace that was for her was also for her dad. And when she realized that, she was able to forgive her father, realizing that it doesn't matter whether you came at the end or you came right at the beginning of the day, but you came in a relationship with the Lord Himself. Grace is equal for everyone. It's a free gift that we receive, even though we don't deserve it. Grace is about mercy. It's not about fairness. And grace is for the last as well as it is for the first. Dear church, it is all about grace. May you and I continue to just think about that vineyard, that landlord, the kingdom of heaven, and God's grace. Freely received from God, freely given by Him to you and me and all of humanity. What a beautiful thing to share. May God bless and keep us all. Amen.